to cut my rather lengthy and fulsome introduction short so that we can go right to the main act. And I'm just really delighted on behalf of the department to welcome Padraic Scanlan, Assistant Professor at the University of Toronto, Centre for Industrial Relations and Human Resources, cross-appointed to really exciting Centre for Diaspora and Transnational Studies. And Dr. Scanlan is also a research associate at the Centre for History and Economics at Harvard University and the University of Cambridge. There's a very recent book, came out in November 2020 with a trade publication, which I think for all of us is deeply impressive. It was reported on in the Guardian newspaper, again, deeply impressive, as an engrossing and powerful study of such an important topic, slave empire, how slavery made modern Britain. And that contribution to, I think, public debate on such an important set of questions, I think, is so impressive. And this really follows a 2017 publication of a work called Freedom's Debtors, British Anti-Slavery in Sierra Leone in the Age of Revolution. This is Yale University Press, 2017. And I could say a lot about this book. Many of the students here have read it and know it, and received the Ferguson Prize, and I was part of the panel on that. It's a deeply influential book on how capitalism is embedded in the practice, not only of slavery, but the abolition of slavery, using Sierra Leone as a case study to reorientate away from London as a metropolitan pivot for our study, and really powerfully challenges that celebration of emancipation led by Britain on behalf of the world, which we still see resonating today. So, very excited to be hearing this new work. Again, the strand or theme of political economy runs right through it, and the title is Irish Lumpers. I cannot read my writing.
It was on the slide.
It was on the slide.
It's okay, imagine a rotten potato.
Yeah. And political economy in Ireland before the Great Famine.
Thank you very much.
So, thank you.
Thanks very much. Okay, so here's an historical question that could also set up a joke. How many potatoes did the Irishmen eat? According to many histories of the Irish Great Famine, the answer is 12 to 14 pounds of potatoes a day, whenever supplies allowed. This estimate of the Irish appetite for potatoes appears in dozens of history books and articles, as well as scientific papers on plant pathogens, as well as Rick Steves' Travel Guide to Ireland 2017 edition. For perspective, and I had a good slide for this, perhaps the best slide of my presentation, 14 pounds of potatoes is roughly 27 potatoes. Given the kind of average weight, your average potato is about half a pound, so you're eating a lot of potatoes if you're eating 14 pounds of potatoes. It's sort of 2 bags that you get at the supermarket. And for reference, the average adult in the generally well-fed United States eats about 4 pounds of food daily. The maximum stomach capacity of the average adult man, that is the amount of food that can be held in the stomach without causing injury, is about 4 liters. Potatoes have an estimated average density of about 675 kilograms per cubic meter. So the average potato comes in at about 675 grams of weight per liter of volume. So it's physically possible then for a grown man to eat about 6 pounds of potatoes in a single meal without rupturing his stomach. An Irishman, I'm not sure about that, it said from the, you try it then. An Irishman could have eaten 4 more pounds of potatoes 3 times a day, but by dinner time, eating would have become a test of endurance, a nauseating ordeal. Before the Great Famine of 1845 to 51, estimates of daily potato consumption in Ireland were closer to the limits of human physiology. In 1835, a royal commission estimated the average daily consumption at about 6 pounds of potatoes per person per day. Edward Gibbon Wakefield, writing during the era of the Napoleonic Wars, estimated 5.5 pounds. In 1807, the agronomist Thomas Martin calculated that the average Irish family went through 588 pounds of potatoes a week, but that consumption included the quantities that pigs, cattle, and poultry also ate, since they also subsisted almost entirely on potatoes. For reference, it was well established among professional dealers in swine for the British market that the average Irish pig needed about 12 pounds of potatoes per day, and cattle nearly twice again as much. So the claim that the Irish consume 12 pounds of potatoes or more each day seems to have originated in an exaggeration and miscommunication. In 1832, in a survey of County Roscommon, the author reported credulously, "I was assured that it is by no means uncommon in times of plenty for a labourer to eat 14 pounds of potatoes at a meal." In the proceedings, which would equal far more per day, in the proceedings of a parliamentary committee on the Irish Poor Law, a commissioner suggested that a working man ought to have 4 pounds of potatoes 3 times a day, or 12 pounds a day, or 3 pounds of meal. And a German tourist writing in 1844 repeated the line, noting that a stone of potatoes is a fair allowance for 1 meal for 3 men. These claims were outliers, but as the German example suggests, as Irish poverty began to become the object of fascination, not only in Britain but also in continental Europe, Irish appetite began to grow to legendary size. In the wake of the famine, a daily diet of 12 pounds of potatoes became an established historical fact about the Irish. So, 12 or more pounds a day embellishes a material reality for Irish peasants before 1845. The Irish really did subsist on potatoes to a remarkable extent, with many families eating only potatoes and milk or potatoes and water and nothing at all if the potatoes failed. So thank you all very much for coming. Apologies for the blank screen behind me, and thanks to the History Department for their very kind invitation. And this morning, I want to offer an interpretation of what the Irish appetite for potatoes can help us to understand about Ireland's place in the British Empire before 1845. Freakish meals served to make Irish potato dependence also seem freakish. It was a cultural quirk in a sense, a cultural quirk that became the beginning of an epical disaster. Potatoes, in this telling, insulated the Irish from the emerging global market that British industry and capital had built and sustained. The Irish ate their potatoes in order to preserve a way of life that was undead in the 19th century by these lights, a kind of agrarian society lurching along within an industrial economy, unaware that it had already perished. On the eve of the Great Famine of 1845 to 1852, the population of Ireland was more than 8 million people. The Irish comprised more than 30% of the population of the United Kingdom. During the famine, at least 1 million people died and 2.5 million emigrated, both to England and overwhelmingly to North America. If the Irish peasantry were impelled to poverty by their freakish appetites, then Britain's Irish question, the problem of Ireland within the Union, was easier to answer. But Irish hunger startled British political economists. Every year, long before the late blight struck first in 1845, or every year that the potato crop was drowned or frostbitten or otherwise failed to meet expectations, hundreds of thousands of Irish peasants lived on the edge of starvation. In 1822, the Poor Law bureaucrat George Nichols wrote, "Irish peasants whose potatoes failed had starved while granaries were full, a, quote, remarkable example of possessing a surplus of food whilst the inhabitants were suffering from actual want. The Irish, he argued, could have bought plenty of food if they only had the money to spend." For Nichols, Irish agricultural labourers were estranged from the market. They lived in the past and needed to be brought into the present. In 1844, another noted economist, Nassau Williams Sr., wrote in the Edinburgh Review that Ireland has, quote, been the most painful subject on which a liberal could employ himself, characterized by, quote, a state of society in which all the means of good seem turned to evil, in which a fertile soil and a temperate climate have produced a population in want of all decency. Senior's abuse begins to show why readers in the 1830s and 1840s were more ready to believe that the Irish ate a daily helping of potatoes, almost too large for the average human stomach. At the same time that the Irish appetite became an object of awe, the French agronomist and chemist Jean-Baptiste Boussingault, in his standard text on organic chemistry, Économie rurale, which was published in 1843-44 and translated across Europe into many European languages, quoted a French official in Pondicherry, and I quote, "It is requisite to have seen the Indians at their meals to have any idea of the enormous quantity of rice they will put into their stomachs. No European could cram so much at one time." And the editor and translator of the American edition, published in 1845, added, in a footnote, "The Irish peasantry, who live so much on potatoes, will consume 14 pounds per diem!" Exclamation. In the 1830s, a cultivar of potato called the lumper, imagine a big pile of white potatoes behind you, heightened both anxiety among British politicians about the precariousness of the tuber and reinforced the idea of Irish eating habits as grotesque and animal. One land surveyor working in Ireland described the lumper as, quote, of a soft, watery quality, unwholesome, unpalatable. In a letter attributed to an Irish tenant farmer from June 1833, the lumper was, quote, barely human food at all, Mix them with any other kind of potatoes and lay them before a pig, and she will not eat one of them until all the good kind are devoured. The lumper was reputed to yield as much as 30% more than other cultivars of potato, like the cup and apple. There were many, many cultivars of potato in Ireland, which were usually sold to wealthier Irish consumers by the peasants who grew them. According to the Royal Commission, the lumper's cheapness and large size had led it to spread throughout the country, quote, and if a better kind be employed, it is in whole baronies the exception, not the rule. Unlike Irish stomach capacity, the lumper was not a legend, although its terrible taste rather, seems to have been exaggerated to emphasize the poverty and degradation of the people who ate it while selling their higher value crop. Indeed, the idea that the highest yield potatoes, which were called the people's crop often in Ireland, were the least tasty, seems to have been as cyclical as potato yields themselves. In 1808, a writer mentioned many varieties grown in Clare, including apples, blacks, cups, leathercoats, grenadiers, and lumpers, among others. At the time, the cup potato, remember the potato of the rich in the 1830s, was the highest yield variety then in cultivation, and it was believed to be, quote, not only more productive, but vastly more nutritive, although far more difficult of digestion. The apple, again a potato for the rich by the 1830s, was described in 1807 by a surveyor in Wexford as the general kind planted, invaluable to the poor. According to an innkeeper and justice of the peace interviewed by Parliament, beggars on the road in Ireland, who were often given handfuls of potatoes by peasants as alms, carried high-yield potatoes from one county to the next. Given that beggars were likely to have been given the most common and productive potato varietals, that might account for the association between high yields and low prestigious food. On the eve of the famine, though, the lumper was in decline. As the botanist David Ferguson noted, the potato, like the tree and the hen, interesting examples, becomes aged and past bearing. You can say that about everyone. Most cultivated potatoes are clones. The eyes of seed potatoes are cut out and planted in sets, as they're called, of chunks of tuber rather than as seeds. So most potatoes that you eat are genetically identical. You know, all the potatoes in the bag are roughly genetically identical to each other. Planting set potatoes dramatically increases yields, but it also produces crops with less genetic diversity, more vulnerable to pests and especially to viruses. Without pesticides, then, the yields of potatoes fall after a few generations in a very predictable cycle. So the potato that was the people's potato changed over time in a predictable cycle in Ireland. And in the mid-19th century, botanists explained this phenomenon as aging. And the lumper, Ferguson concluded, was very old. An Irish agricultural magazine had begun to sound the alarm in 1834 when farmers reported that the lumper was in some fields now barely producing more than the sets that farmers had planted in the ground. And although the lumper was then nothing special, a part of a cycle of potato varieties shaped by rising and falling yields and the biology of plants, it too has become a symbol of Irish strangeness. An irresistible detail for historians that the Irish starved because their lumpers failed. I think it's the name as part of the appeal. I've found references to the Irish lumper as nearly as often as you can find references to 14-pound helpings of potatoes. These references to the Irish lumper emphasize, I would argue, that the Irish ate potatoes in a sense because their bodies had become specialized for eating potatoes. And the potatoes that they ate and cultivated specifically for high yields were necessary in order to meet their ever-increasing appetites, although pigs would reject the same potatoes that an Irishman would eat with gusto. Potatoes are very efficient crops. I don't work for the Potato Council, but they are. And they can produce enormous yields. The potato is very nutritious. Potatoes and milk are, in fact, a nutritionally complete, a very bland diet. But the potatoes seem to be enabling Ireland to elude British modernity, to push away from a United Kingdom that was barely 40 years old. The Irish question, then, for British politicians, was of how to balance Ireland's poverty, population, and political unrest against the resources that Ireland provided to the empire, namely food, above all food, but also soldiers and professionals. The potato made both possible by allowing the poorest Irish workers to subsist on minuscule rented holdings of land, a cheap labor force that was made available without any redistribution of land or indeed any industrialization. As the lead bureaucrat at the Treasury responsible for famine relief, Charles Trevelyan, wrote, the potato allowed the Irish to seek, quote, the cheapest description of food at the smallest expense of labor. Many feared that the system was unsustainable, and by this measure, the Great Famine was an act of God that could wipe the slate clean and prepare Ireland for reform. It killed Irish lumpers. British observers saw Ireland and they saw the past. They saw a way of life preserved. Imagine on the screen, an iron pot, because it's significant, with 3 legs. perhaps in defiance of British attempts to civilize and modernize. Irish landowners, for example, amateur archaeologists, who dug in the bogs on their property were fascinated when they found ancient three-legged iron pots, so pots that are designed not to be hung over a fire, but to have a fire built underneath them, so they're for outdoor cooking, or for cooking in a space with no chimney, as well as thousand-year-old yew trees preserved in the deep, cold, wet, and acidic moss. Irish peasants still used three-legged pots in the 1840s, and there were virtually no more trees in Ireland. And so the people who dug up these objects and these preserved plants concluded that the Irish were effectively unchanged in many of their ways of life since antiquity. And moreover, that the ancient Irish had sort of fouled their nest with reckless deforestation, and that Britain could preserve the best parts of that heritage and reform the rest of it. But as our German visitor to Ireland our German visitor to Ireland saw the scene more clearly. He had seen, he wrote, peasants in the Baltic who lived in deep poverty, but still had national dress, or particular forms of housing, or particular forms of food preservation. In Ireland, he wrote, there nowhere exists an old fixed form of anything. The Irish were not estranged from the market then, they lived in its teeth. The potato, far from protecting Irish labourers, exposed them to the risks and pitfalls of the emerging British industrial economy. As the mystic and Irish nationalist James Fintan Lalore wrote, the potato was our sole and only capital. Irish hyperdependence on potatoes was a consequence of Ireland's place in the political economy of the United Kingdom. The country produced grain and other agricultural products for a national market on agricultural land that was vastly undercapitalized in comparison with England and Scotland. Rather than distancing Irish peasants from wages, credit, debt, and other elements of capitalist exchange, the potato economy instead demanded wagers from the poorest peasants on the value of their crop in order to pay their rent and protect their access to land. By the time of the Great Famine, Ireland was fully integrated into the British imperial economy, and it was vulnerable to the rise and fall of world commodity markets and the industrial business cycle. Although many peasants paid their rents in potatoes and were paid wages in land, Irish peasants were debtors and they were speculators, betting on rental rates and yields to carve out tiny margins of profit with the sale of their potatoes and their pigs, of which more later. The potato was not always a symbol of backwardness. For some Enlightenment theorists of population and political economy, the tuber seemed to harmonize the needs of ambitious European states with the demands of peasants for labor, and for land and for food. Peasants would increase in number and grow more cash crops for export that they would not consume, since they could eat potatoes that were grown on small or nutrient-poor patches of land. Adam Smith, for example, speculated that potatoes could regulate rents by this process, and thus insulate the poorest agrarian workers from fluctuations in the prices of other commodities. In the 18th century, though, the Irish export economy grew. After the American Revolution, the Irish Parliament, which was still extant, offered bounties for exporting grain, and more Irish land was rapidly converted from pasture into tillage. In competition with England, Ireland's very small industrial sector, which was primarily a linen manufacturer in Ulster, also shrank. As a part of the Acts of Union of 1800 and 1801, Ireland was charged with 2/17 of the growing national debt of the United Kingdom. Britain raised, and this would imagine statistics on the screen, because this is number dance, guys, so bear with me. Britain raised an average of £58 million in revenue each year between 1801 and 1816, while Ireland raised an average of £4.9 million. However, while Britain ended up spending an average of £81 million per year, or roughly 28% more than its total tax revenue, Ireland spent nearly £10 million per year, or 51% more, while Britain raised nearly 90% of the total revenue of the United Kingdom. So although Ireland's proportion of the debt was small, each year Ireland fell deeper and deeper into debt, while the share of the British economy that was produced by England grew. Irish debt dragged on the economy of the island, making borrowing extremely expensive. In consequence, Ireland began to export more and more grain, butter, and other goods, but without much capital. As Nassau Senior complained, English farmers, that is, tenant farmers in England, would have as much as 3,000 pounds of capital to their names and would rent hundreds or even thousands of acres from aristocrats and pay wages to labourers to tend their fields. In Ireland, though, a substantial farmer, someone who is relatively well-to-do, might rent, say, 20 acres of land with 100 times less capital. At the same time, between 1779 and 1841, the Irish population, like the population of the rest of the United Kingdom, grew at least 172%. So the Union formed was a kind of ticking time bomb waiting to go off. And it was formed at a time of booming grain prices. And during the Napoleonic Wars, agriculturalists interested in the improvement of land were delighted to see tillage take the place of pasture, along with, quote, the great extension of the potato culture and a very happy rise in rents. Because potatoes were useful as both a rotation crop for wheat, oats, barley, and clover, and because a potato ground could support a population of laborers large enough to take in grain at harvest at low rates of wages without actually ever lowering rent, the potato system seemed like cause for celebration. It seemed like a perfect engine for accelerating economic growth. Rents rose in Newmarket, a town in County Cork, for example, from about 26 shillings an acre in 1798 to £3 in 1808, which is a very dramatic rise in rent. But after 1815, the price of grain collapsed. It peaked in 1817 and then fell steadily throughout the 19th century. As the historian Peter Gray notes, the consequence was an even more rapid expansion of tillage in Ireland, and the transformation of Ireland into what he calls a small open economy that was vulnerable to the business cycle. This process was only accelerated by the absorption of Ireland's treasury into the exchequer in 1815, and then the adoption of a common currency, the common pound sterling, in 1826. Within the United Kingdom, Ireland became an agricultural export economy, primarily supplying Britain with grain, especially with oats, and with other products, especially butter and pork, as Britain industrialized. By 1830, for example, roughly 17% of Irish workers were employed in industry, primarily in linen and wool production and almost entirely in Ulster, compared with 70% of British workers who were classified as industrial laborers. So as debt from the Union squeezed the Irish economy, British political economists in political ascendance at the time began to sour on the potato, so Smith's optimism about potatoes fell. Thomas Malthus, for example, argued their returns would diminish. As population grew, he wrote, there is no reason why potatoes should not ultimately be as scarce and as economically consumed as the bread and cheese of the English laborer, which would then leave the laboring poor worse off. John Ramsay McCullough expanded on Malthus's argument. In England, he noted, where workers ate bread that they bought with wages, a fall in wages would push them toward eating cheaper food like potatoes. But in places dependent on potatoes, there would be nothing cheaper to buy, making price fluctuations especially brutal to potato eaters. Harriet Martineau was explicit in moralizing the production of wheat, to which she attributed civilizing properties. Wheat, she argued, took more effort to grow, and thus dispelled indolence. It could be stored as insurance against a future calamity, and thus promote prudence. Where men have been taught to prefer wheat bread, she wrote, it is more likely that their children should be taught to seek butcher's meat than be allowed to fall back to potatoes. And that be allowed is doing a lot of work for Martineau there, I think. Potatoes could feed the multitude, but they were fickle, as we've seen, and they were culturally suspect. Set planting, as I've mentioned, tended towards this cycle of boom and bust. Although it produces from a given acreage more human food than any other crop, one writer commented, it is the most treacherous and perishable one. As another writer wrote in 1812, everyone who knows Ireland is convinced that years of scarcity in the country are very frequent. The potato made Ireland doubly vulnerable to oscillations in the global industrial capitalist British Empire. Ireland was vulnerable both to crop failure and to macroeconomic pressure, and sometimes to both at once. For many British observers, Irish poverty, though, was not a function of imperial political economy, it was a function of Irish cultural backwardness, the Irish lumpers trapped in a quasi-feudal past. As one of the members of the Royal Commission on the Irish Poor commented, Ireland was, quote, mired in a system rather that which has existed throughout Europe in the early period, where, quote, a tenant makes his wages out of the soil he occupies. The Irish peasant is part serf, receiving his wages in land, and part farmer. I mean, Marx takes this up in the 18th Brumaire when he describes the French peasantry, themselves potato eaters, as, quote, formed by simple accretion, much as potatoes in a sack form a sack of potatoes. But the potato economy was not simple, it was not atomized, and it was not an atavism. For the Irish poor, living in this potato economy meant insulation from the market, meant not insulation from the market, but rather deep and painful connection. Ireland's role within the imperial economy was to deliver agricultural products to England and Scotland and to earn rent for landlords. As one MP commented in 1836, Ireland exported grain even, or perhaps especially, when the price fell in the overall British market. Rent, he wrote, is in a great measure fixed in Ireland, he explained, and the middleman simply screws it out of the tenant. When prices fell in global markets, Irish peasants had to sell more rather than less of their crop in order to meet their rent, and sometimes they had to sell their pigs, more later. I keep on foreshadowing that a bit. It's lurking in the background. Rather than holding on to grain and other goods until prices increased, quote, when the prices are low in Ireland, there is the greatest export to England because the greatest pressure to run. The availability of land for growing potatoes was also a function of the demand for grain and beef in Britain, and thus it connected Irish peasants to imperial commodity markets. Living on potato land required constant wagers, constant speculation, and constant forms of arbitrage made on razor-thin margins. And rather than, as I've said, protecting peasants from the market, the more peasants subsisted on potatoes, the more exposed to those risks they were. Ireland was poor, although economic historians dispute whether Ireland just before the famine was any worse off than Ireland in the late 18th century, which seems to me the definition of an academic debate. Likewise, historians have argued over when the potato became the hyper-staple of the Irish peasantry. But whether the potato became the people's food in the era of Oliver Cromwell or by the 1780s, and there's a lot of rich historical debate about when exactly the potato took over as Ireland's main subsistence food, by the era of the famine, roughly 60% of the population of Ireland, concentrated in the densely populated southwest, lived virtually exclusively on potatoes. As K.H. Connell writes, potatoes became an entire political economy in themselves, and it was, quote, the commanding obligation of securing the privilege of planting potatoes that determined the nature of all other activities. The potato economy had its own regular rhythm. Agricultural workers planted in the spring, they took their potatoes out in October or November, and then they stored them in pits. And there's a very famous painting of an Irish peasant family discovering that the potatoes in their pits have been blighted, and you can kind of see from the painting exactly what those pits look like. They're kind of above ground, and you can see in the image that it's just been cut open and the blighted potatoes are spilled out onto the ground. If a peasant had enough land, they might also grow wheat or oats for sale to the many brokers who also managed rental agreements between landlords, smaller tenants, and nearly landless peasants. For Irish people dependent on potatoes alone, by the summer, most of the potatoes from the crop would be gone. So even in a year when the potatoes weren't blighted, it was likely that many families would run out by April or May. And it was at this time, in the early summer, that many Irish men left for England to work on English farms, to take in the harvest. If there were not enough potatoes left in a family's pits, then the women and children would live on the road in another part of the country, begging for donations of money or of potatoes, which were then either eaten or sold, since in the summer, potatoes fetched the highest prices. As the potatoes ran low, people would begin to ask for them boiled with a bone or a moon in the middle, that is to say, half-boiled, to leave the, quote, heart or central nucleus of the potato parboiled, hard, and waxy, so it looks like a moon in the center of the potato. Laborers believed that this bone took longer to digest in the stomach, and so it effectively acted as 2 meals in one. Many Irish peasants grew potatoes in what was called the lazy bed system. Farmers would dig their beds in the soil from 3 to 5 feet wide and lay their sets of potatoes, the eyes of the potato cut out, about 6 inches apart from each other on the beds. You can do this, by the way, if you have like some space in your yard and a big bag of manure. Covering them with manure and with soil dug out from long trenches cut between each bed. As the potatoes sprouted, they were then covered partially again with manure, so it was a very manure-intensive form of agriculture. The layers of earth cut down on any need to weed, as the fast-growing potatoes, quote, get the mastery of any weeds that attempt to spring up. And so weeders could simply walk along the trenches of the lazy beds and drop the weeds into them as they were pulled up to add to the fertilizer, a task that was easy for children to do because the beds were at most 5 feet wide. Potatoes could be planted twice on lazy beds, with the trenches moved to where the centers of the beds were the year before, as, quote, this interchange the more effectually loosens the soil and more perfectly prepares it for the aftercrop of corn, that is, oats in this case. Lazy bed cultivation, perhaps because of the name, or as well as because it was an object of British curiosity, as it was done with 6-foot-long, narrow, iron-tipped spades that could be used without stooping by Irish women, and British reformers made a great deal of both the fact that lazy bed cultivation was called lazy bed cultivation, and that it could be done without stooping. The idea being that if it hurt more to work, the work was more valuable. By narrow-tipped iron spades that could be used without stooping by Irish women, men, and children wearing long aprons and carrying bags of potato sets. Grain, like potatoes, was grown by farmers holding land of all sizes. Potato crops prepared land for exportable grain, but potatoes themselves were hardly ever exported. Indeed, they were virtually never exported. Most were sold in Ireland. Most were eaten by the people who grew them, and some were sold in Ireland, but almost always locally. Potatoes did not transport well. Economic historians estimate that the value of a potato crop being transported falls at the rate of about 2% per mile. And potato storage requires no capital and no equipment. It just requires a hole in the ground. But potato prices could vary by as much as 30 to 50% from the annual scarcity of summer to the harvest in the autumn. So at the time, so in a country of small plots and high rents, by the early 1840s at least, most farmers sold all their grain and sometimes part of their crop to meet their rent obligations. And they weren't able to hold on to their crop in order to sell it at a time when the prices were high, because the rents were often called in at a time when the prices, when potato scarcity was at its greatest peak. One visitor heard reports of livestock that had been bought as speculative investments for £6 or £7, sold for half their value in order to cover rent, and of oatmeal bought on credit for, say, 20 shillings and then sold back to creditors for 10. Farmers with cows would sell all of their butter and cream, keeping at most the skim milk and buttermilk. As Nassau Senior wrote, Irish farmers made their rent by, quote, calculating how small a portion of his tenement devoted to the most abundant variety of the most abundant food will feed his family. Irish workers also did whatever work they could for cash. At a parliamentary hearing, one commentator remarked they are ready to grasp at anything that will enable them to earn a ready penny, whether pulling gravel or lime or carrying chunks of the flammable peat that most Irish peasants used to fuel the market. I could do another 45 minutes on peat, but I won't inflict that on you. Strikingly, very little money exchanged hands, although amounts of rent were precisely calculated in pounds sterling. Without cash, obligations were met on the nominal value of different crops and grazing lands and tasks. The time and labor, for example, that was required to plant a peck of flax or a barrel of corn, the time that was needed for setting a barrel of potatoes, that is, planting it, the amount of cow's grass, that was the reckoning of the amount of grass that a cow needed for grazing. Irish labourers themselves fell into several different classes. In Ireland, labourers might pay rent to their landlords, but they were paid in wages. In Ireland, large landowners rented their land out in much smaller parcels, as we've seen, of 5 to 20 acres compared with hundreds or thousands in England. Unlike in England, where landlords would lease the land and where landlords who leased the land would reckon capital improvements into the land, land in Ireland was leased as soil only. And in fact, if a tenant improved the land that he had rented, often the landlord would raise the rent. So there was very little economic incentive to improve land. Some tenants would waive their rent in order to improve their property. These farmers then rented out their own land to a variety of poorer subtenants. Cottiers, as they were called, rented small acreages, let's say 5 acres, from larger farmers, and usually paid their rent in cash and grew crops for the market. Some cottiers were bound under the terms of their leases to work a certain number of days during the year for their landlord, while others worked off part of the cost of their rent with each day of labor credited against the amount owing. But below cottier tenants were conacre tenants, cornacre, although the system had many different names across Ireland, including mock ground in Clare, Dairyland in Wexford, Porterland and Roodland elsewhere in Ireland. Conacre tenants depended on the potato the most, and were in consequence the most vulnerable to both changes in the price of global commodities and to failures of the potato crop. Conacre land was land, usually very little land, often as little as a half acre, that was rented for a single season of 10 months, not the only 10 months, generally pre-fertilized with manure, at a rent of up to £10 per acre for the rest manured land, which is an eye-popping rate of rent. Conacre tenants paid their rent in money, but because of their often extreme poverty, the cottier tenants paid their rent in money, but because they were because of their often extreme poverty, they were generally very poor themselves, they would often collect rent from conacre tenants by labor or by claiming a portion of their tenant's crop. By 1845, 350,000 acres of land were rented in these arrangements, and they produced 2.1 million tons of potatoes, and they supplied 75% of the food eaten by landless rural Irish labourers. And conacre food was usually exhausted by May. If the potatoes were gone by May, the new crop could not be dug until at least the middle of August. Every year then, the poorest Irish lived on the edge of starvation long before the potato famine. Poverty, though, was shameful and secret. Those who had to beg left their homes and wandered to places where they would never be recognized. Men would have their wives or children bring them empty plates in the fields, hidden under a cloth, and feign eating, with their backs to their fellow laborers to avoid being seen to have nothing to eat. Beggars would empty their pockets on their potato sacks if asked. It was part of the kind of rural economy that if somebody asked you for potatoes, you would give it to them. At night, though, the poor regularly stole potatoes from the fields and from their neighbors' stores. They would send their children secretly to milk cows or to bleed them, and sort of collect the blood in buckets. Charity and theft were manifestations of the same phenomenon, by day and by night. Ireland's place in the British imperial economy and within the Union had left millions exposed to market forces, to low wages, to high rents, and to predatory credit. What people did to survive, begging by day and stealing by night, was generally forgiven. The irony of Ireland's densely populated southwest was that the labor-intensive work of potato planting, weeding, and gathering often required much more labor than was available. Everyone needed to gather their potatoes, which gave Conacher tenants something with which they could bargain. Conacher tenants were also betting on the price of their potatoes. Under most arrangements, they were either able to harvest their own crops or go to market to buy them at the end of their tenancy in the autumn, harvest time, when the market was glutted, rather than buying potatoes during the annual scarcity in the summer. Conacher renters, and I quote, bargained a certainty for a possibility. He was paid the wages of his labor, not in money, but in land. In some parts of Ireland, Conacher tenants were required to tell their landlords by a fixed date if they intended to pay their rent or lose their crop. Rather than medieval peasants, Conacher tenants were speculators. They were speculating on the margins of a market in land, and they were betting on the profligacy of potatoes. If a tenant chose to give up his crop and keep his rent money, then he was wagering that the price of potatoes in the market would be low enough to feed his family when the rent was due. One official commented, in the south of Ireland, a practice prevails of selling potatoes in the month of March to be paid in September at the highest price between March and September. The potatoes shrink, they physically shrink in weight, as anybody, if you leave potatoes in your cupboard, you notice that they shrink in size. The potatoes, and they're paid for based on their weight, so they shrink in value as they shrink in size. The potatoes shrink in weight between March and September, and the seller has, as I before stated, the advantage of the July price. The Royal Commission of 1835 found that in most cases, the average crop produced about 10 shillings more than the total rent, seed, and labor of the tenant, which is a tiny profit, eked out on a razor margin. A bad year, though, would mean near starvation. In times of crop failure, the price of food in Ireland rose to as much as 60% over the usual market rate. Conacher tenants also speculated on the labor market. Many counted on reducing their rent by selling their labor, again without using cash, in a formal agreement with their landlord, or to bank on a shortage of labor at harvest time. As the Royal Commission noted, the potato, as long as it lasts, is a common fund upon which every person in distress has an acknowledged claim. James Scott, in his recent work on the origins of settled society, has remarked on the fiscal legibility of wheat and has treated the potato and cassava and other similar tuber crops as sort of the anarchist crops. For William Cronin, writing on the Great West, wheat has becomes a metaphor for the fungibility and flow of capital. If grain, however, represented the speed and power of capitalism, potatoes represented its mirror image, peasants exposed to economic risk and deeply in debt. Ireland was, as one historian writes, an economy of arrears. Conacher was a complex market, reckoned in potatoes and shaped by periodic scarcity. As the American abolitionist Asenath Nicholson wrote, a famine is always in Ireland, to a certain degree. And now finally, the pigs that turned up their snouts at Irish, it's worth the wait, I promise. The pigs that turned up their snouts at Irish lumpers were the other pillar of the potato system. Pigs could pay the rent, and although Irish peasants had kept pigs throughout the 18th century, the Union moved Irish swine also into the imperial marketplace. In 1801, Ireland exported roughly 2,000 pigs to Britain. By 1837, it exported 700,000 annually. By the 1840s, 840 tons of pork were sold every year at Newgate Market in London, and 3,500 tons at Leadenhall. So Ireland was exporting both live animals and also salted pork. The pigs, as we've seen, ate potatoes. They ate whatever scraps were left, and they ate more. Unlike the Irish, who in their numbers and poverty caused land to be subdivided that might otherwise have been consolidated, pigs were cheap and pigs were profitable. The small cost at which these animals can be reared, one breeder wrote in 1847, and their fecundity and their wonderful powers of thriving under disadvantage rendered them a blessing. Pigs also were purchased on credit, but they were a more reliable bet than potatoes, at least as a failsafe against eviction due to unpaid rent. Many Irish families allowed pigs into their homes, where some writers described them as, quote, as much a domestic animal as the dog, brought to fair or to slaughter by children on leashes. The children weren't on leashes, the pigs were. But children, I realize it's not clear from the sentence. But children must have got over their sorrow, since political economists estimated that, quote, an acre of potatoes makes a ton of pork. In Britain, Paddy and his beloved pig were stock characters. And the Irish did often joke about pigs who paid the rent. But the jokes, which seemed straightforward, blithe, and lighthearted in British magazines, and Punch, for example, eager to see the Irish as jolly, earthy, and uncivilized in the past, were, I think, gallows humor. The Irish poor needed their pigs to survive, and they needed to live in the same spaces as their pigs because they had to, right? Pigs are powerful animals, intelligent omnivores that are very happy to eat flesh, including human flesh, when they can find it. For Irish children, who in the British imaginary rolled around and played with the family pigs, like little piglets themselves, family pigs must sometimes have been terrifying. In reformist tracts aimed at Irish cottagers, parents were warned not to leave their children alone with the pigs, especially with sows nursing piglets. A toddler whose father fell asleep was playing with a litter of pigs and woke up to see the poor little thing in a gore of blood and its face so eaten by the nasty sow that the life was out of it, sure enough. Pig keeping was common in England as well, although English peasants tended to keep, or English agricultural laborers tended to keep their pigs in separate buildings. For poor laborers, a cottage pig could dispose of waste by eating it and then be fattened, either for sale or for consumption. There were at least 1 million cottage pigs in England in the later Victorian era. Although virtually every English agricultural laboring family had a pig, the Irish pig in particular became a symbol of backwardness as well. William Cobbett, for example, was horrified to hear that potato grounds were spreading through the west of England and commented that this has a tendency to bring Irish labourers down to the state of the Irish, whose mode of living, as to food, is but one remove from that of the pig, and of an ill-fed pig too. An early 19th century reformer commented that they prefer the pig's accommodation to their own. In the early days of the Union, this was played for laughs, but by the time Thomas Carlyle, who has haunted all of my research, I think, in every field, visited Ireland in the famine, he said he was sad to see that in Ireland, human swinery has here reached its acme. The potato economy then provided steady, often substantial rents to landlords. For example, in Bally, in County Limerick during the famine, out of 1,320 houses, 500 were occupied by cottiers or by conicre tenants. The rest were occupied by farmers renting 5 to 15 acres, with a few tradespeople, shopkeepers, priests, and gentry. At a time when daily wages in Ireland stood at 6 pence a day, and for perspective, that's a lower rate of wages than colonial Sierra Leone at the same time in the 1840s, with potatoes, stood at 6 pence a day with potatoes, or 8 pence a day without potatoes. The rental value of the properties in the district stood at £14,000. So poverty was very profitable if you owned the land. I'm certainly not the first person to make that observation. All this then was the potato economy before the famine. A squeeze on peasants to produce crops for the British market, regardless of demand and pricing, shored up by cyclically high yields of potatoes and a reliable market for pork. The potato exposed peasants to the risks of the global market and thrust Ireland into imperial capitalist modernity. As a symbol, though, it made the Irish strange, the owners of piggish appetites and palates. Nassau Senior was baffled by Ireland's apparent backwardness. The Irish depended on the potato and on, quote, the occupation of land rather than the wages of labor, living in hovels and following their priests. In one cartoon from Punch, and imagine Robert Peel sweating, pushing a rock up the hill, Robert Peel as Sisyphus pushes his Irish rock up the mountain, with Daniel O'Connell and John Russell as the Furies behind egging him on. In the 18th century, the potato was, at least for some agronomists and political economists, a symbol of progress. On the eve of the famine, though, it was a symbol of futility and of backwardness. And so when the late blight finally first struck in 1845, many Britons, and many wealthy Irish too, were horrified, but they were prepared, I think, to see the tragedy as an opportunity to bring Ireland, at last, into the disinfecting sunlight of modern